Cool, mate. We're away.
Oh, well, this is a kind of message for Winston Peters. And first of all, thank you for listening to New Zealanders. They've said in their agreement with the coalition that they would support this bill only if there are sufficient safeguards for the public, for nature, for the food system. And there are no safeguards in that bill. They cannot tinker around the edges. They've really got to look at the fundamentals that are missing from the bill. So my message to Mr. Peters is think about the need for the precautionary principle to be back in the bill. They've removed it. Think about the need for ethics to be part of this bill because they've removed that. Think about protecting non-GMO production and the non-GMO GE-free regions, for example, Hastings, which are the backbone of our export economy. Think of that. Think about continuing the added value that we get from being GE-free in our export markets. Consider liability on the users of GE because they need to be constrained. They need to be responsible if they contaminate other farms and exports. And finally, we can't have mandatory approvals. We cannot have the regulator's hands tied that he must or she must approve something that's been approved overseas, including emergency medical uses of gene technology. If those fundamentals, and probably some others, are addressed in this bill, then New Zealand First can potentially support it. But at this stage, with those things not in the bill, they cannot support it.
They have that in their coalition agreement though, right?
But only if there's sufficient safeguards. And what I'm saying, and what the independent scientists are saying, is the sufficient safeguards are missing from this bill. It's basically a jack-up. It's been written by industry for industry. And at the end of the day, if New Zealand First want to live up to its name and put New Zealand first, they have to say no.
I love that, Jon. Okay. Anyone want any more touch points on that?
That's it.
Yeah, nice. Well, we can just roll in to the rest. So who's Jon Carapiet? Jon is a GE-free NZ spokesperson. You're also a trustee for Physicians in Science and Global Responsibility, but you're also a long-time market researcher, which I'm keen to chat with you about. But you're also the voice for Brand New Zealand, a very important voice right now. But most people that have engaged with our content know you because you've been involved for how many years in this issue now, Jon?
Probably going on for 25.
25 years.
Something like that.
Wow. Can I ask when you first got involved in it? When was your first encounter with it?
In the late 1990s, the GE soy was coming into America. And the plan was then to mix it up with the non-GMO soy so no one would have a choice. And at that point, the public all around the world started to wake up to this. And I actually phoned up a scientist in the UK who was the lead scientist in the UK on genetic engineering. His name was Arpad Pushtai. I actually phoned him up to say, how significant is this issue? Are you just a little bit concerned? Or are you majorly concerned? What is it that we need to be understanding of the technology and your issues? And as I say, he was a GE scientist. And he went on television in Britain and said, look, his research was showing concerns. It shouldn't be in the food system at this stage. And his whole research was shut down. So it's a story in its own right. And I also spoke to another scientist in the UK at that time to try and understand whether Arpad was wrong. Should I believe this scientist? And the answer was yes, we should. And even though there was a lot of attacks on Dr. Pushtai because he spoke out, the results from the following few years of his research being reviewed by other scientists, even though it was shut down straight after his speaking out, the results are that there is evidence of harm. And there's other scientists who have done studies with GMO food, particularly in animals. There's not many studies in humans, actually. But his message 25 years ago is still as relevant as it was then today, because the research hasn't been done. They're trying to introduce GMOs into the food system without giving people a choice or traceability. And that message is, as I say, still relevant today. People want a choice. People want containment. People want control of GMOs. They do not want the kind of vision that's being proffered to the public all over the world.
Is that Corngate? Is that what you're talking about?
No, this was before Corngate. Corngate was the issue whereby New Zealand put in strict controls and had a zero tolerance for contamination of GMOs. And Corngate was about officials seeming to pass by known contamination in the field and then being called out that they were passing it by and having to stop it. So that's what Corngate was about.
For people that don't know, I mean, the reason we're here and the reason we're having this conversation is that we want to elevate people like your voices. But ultimately, the reason we're here is because of the gene technology bill. For people that are new to this issue or don't really understand what GE or what GMO is. Could you explain what this bill does and how this might impact New Zealanders?
So for 20 odd years, we've had quite strict regulations in New Zealand through what's called the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, the HASNO Act. Now, that's got some flaws. It's not perfect. But one of the things that's been debated today is whether that's actually preserved and protected New Zealand most efficiently, and whether we should actually continue to have that act in place, maybe reform it, because industry is saying it's too constraining, particularly in the medical uses in containment. So that debate should have happened. But what happened instead was that the government basically handed over the writing of a new bill to liberalise gene technology in New Zealand, purely to benefit the biotechnology industry, not engaging with farmers and exporters and the consumers and the public. And the deal has been over the last 20 years that certainly there should be a choice, so products should be labelled in supermarkets. And the strict regulations have effectively paused people from applying to have release of GMOs, which they could do. And the argument has been that it's because the rules are so strict and costly that that's why they want to get rid of these rules and have these new rules. But unfortunately, there's something else that's behind why we haven't got GMOs growing in New Zealand, and that's the market. Globally, the market, the consumer in our international markets is saying they don't really want GMOs. They don't want gene editing. They certainly don't want it unlabelled in the food system. So that's the real reason why I believe we don't have GMOs in New Zealand, apart from the fact that there are some strict rules. Those rules have been taken away. It's being opened up for... open slather's a bit rich, I guess, except for the fact that this bill excludes a whole lot of organisms, new organisms, from any regulation at all. The companies are left to look after whether it's safe, whether it's what they think it is, and market it. So that's really overturning the social contract, the social license for genetic engineering at all. Because I think people have been generally comfortable with medical uses, for example, making insulin for diabetics. There's other uses that are not so good, but essentially contained ethical uses are not the issue. It's the external uses in the environment, and we haven't had that in New Zealand, and that's what we're now facing. So all those complexities that flow out of that, all the how do you trace it, how do you keep non-GMO production safe, how do you maintain our exports, how do you maintain the right to choose, that's all being overturned.
Completely overturned. So am I right in understanding that it would make New Zealand the most permissive country in the world for GMO regulation? Is that?
That's certainly what the independent scientists are saying. That what they're saying is that instead of being like a kind of arc of like an isolated country where we could be safely producing safe non-GMO food and have that point of difference in the market like we do today, they're kind of making us potentially into an experimental lab, because the government's really, that bill is really designed to enable more GMOs and more genetic engineering from industry without those controls, without that traceability, without that defense of the non-GMO benefit in our export markets. So that is what's happening.
So you've got our RMA reform out at the moment as well, but there's aspects to the gene technology bill that are in some way connected to removal of precautionary principles with certain chapters. And I know you were doing a presentation or a speech, or speaking up on behalf of the community recently. Could you maybe just explain what you were told that you couldn't speak about? Because I want to touch on that.
So in this gene technology bill, there's a couple of lines hidden in a very long bill, and people might not have noticed it, but it takes away the powers of local councils to regulate GMOs. Now, not all councils are doing that. But about 10 more or so years ago, there was an inter-council working group, which was Northland, Auckland, Whangarei, other councils were involved. And they basically collaborated, and they said, look, what does the HASNO Act, the current law, do in terms of exposing ratepayers and the environment to risk? And they identified that it does expose, even today, because there's no ban, there would be risks to the local areas, and including ratepayers ending up having to clean up a company's experimental site if that company goes bankrupt. And that has happened in New Zealand. So it's not like a theoretical example. It has actually happened. So the fact that this is going on, that the removal of the precautionary principle from the bill at the national level is one thing. So the regulator is being told you cannot any longer apply the precautionary principle. Now that needs to be back in the legislation, because the precautionary principle is basically, if we're getting so clever with our technology and it's advancing all the time, maybe we're doing something that is fundamentally unknown in terms of its threat to the environment. And the regulator should be able to say, look, we've got to stop that. We can't do that. That power has been taken away at the national level, or that responsibility rather. But what also happened at the local level was the councils put in precautions. They asked for bonds if someone's going to do an experiment. They asked for clean-up costs, to be ready and available if they go bankrupt. Those precautions and protections in the local plans are also being taken away. And the outrageous thing in terms of Auckland Council was that the councillors were told by officials, you cannot talk about the fact that certain parts of the unitary plan are to be removed. And the relationship to the RMA is that these powers come through the RMA. They don't come through the HASNO Act, they come through the RMA, the responsibilities of local councils to protect their areas and their land and land management and water management. So to take away precaution at the national level and to take away precaution at the local level is really wrong, because we need precaution in the bill. And certainly to deny the democratic process that led to those precautions in the local plans, to deny that and to remove that democratic process is again also wrong. A couple of days ago, there was a presentation that was about the RMA and about the removal of the 4 well-beings from the remit of local government. And those 4 well-beings are social, environmental, economic, and cultural, kind of human values about society and community. And what we've seeing, and I guess it's not just in the gene technology bill, but this kind of steady encroachment of a kind of rationalist, functionalist approach to government and democracy. Now, if councils are told, you can't talk about this, you can't consider these aspects by government changing the remit of local councils, that's a lot of loss of democracy. And what we talked about at council the other day was that loss of democracy is already happening because the councillors have been denied the right to talk about the removal of protections in the unitary plan because it's nothing to do with them, governments calling the shots. Now, that's a real failure of our council. And in fact, one of the councillors said, we have been found wanting on this matter. And they have been found wanting. They can still write to the select committee. They can still engage in this process because it's not over.
So where is the bill now? Its kind of formation in legislation in Parliament, John? What's the timelines on it?
So it came out to public consultation just before Christmas. A lot of people were away. A lot of New Zealanders do not know this bill is proceeding through Parliament. But literally on the 22nd of August, the Select Committee is due to report back on the bill. Now, what they report back on is really very important for New Zealand because I watched the videos of the submissions to the Select Committee on this bill. Not everyone was against it. But I understand that about 97% of the submissions were against this bill. And the question is, was that select committee able to navigate this enormous conflict between the public interest, what the public want, what exporters want, what farmers want, which is the right to choose, which is moderation of this gene technology, or will they continue to allow this bill to have been hijacked by the very industry that it serves? And that hijack, by the way, transfers costs to the public, to other producers, takes away the right to choose. And that mix of contradictions needs to have been navigated by the Select Committee. Now, whether they have the courage to do that, whether they have the courage to say, you've got to stop this bill, it is not fit for purpose. Certainly we could maintain HASNO and update that. Certainly we could, for example, split the bill and prevent environmental release at this stage, but allow improved access to medical research as long as it's ethical and contained. There's a number of things they could do. We'll find out not too long away what they decide to do. But that's where New Zealand First comes in, because they're part of the government, but they're also saying that they will listen to the public and serve the national interest. And the deal with the government coalition agreement is that New Zealand First only agreed to support this bill if there are sufficient safeguards, especially around the food and environmental uses. And as I say to you now, and as the independent scientists are saying, it hasn't got those safeguards. And it's not going to be enough for New Zealand First to win in the Select Committee with a bit of tinkering around the edges. Those fundamental changes to the bill need to be there, or it cannot proceed. And when I say fundamental changes, restore the precautionary principle, to have that backstop from extremely advancing but potentially much more risky science in the environment. Restore ethics, because the ethical considerations around genetic engineering are not just about human use, but also about animal use. There's a lot of things you can do to animals with genetic engineering that have to have ethical oversight. And years ago, there was a bioethics council established after the Royal Commission on GMOs. It said we've got to have some kind of body to oversee the ethical aspects. That bioethics council was then abolished by the National Party a few years later. And this bill has no mention of ethics. So ethics has gone missing in the most powerful technology in the world, and it needs to be restored. And as I said, the other things that are missing from this bill are basic protections for non-GMO producers. It basically throws them under the bus and says, well, you're going to have to protect your own crops and your own food system. You're going to have to pay to have testing. You're going to have to carry these costs so we, the biotechnology industry, can do what we want to do. Now, again, that's a completely inappropriate transfer of costs from one industry to the public and to other industries. And then there's final few things, which is it takes away those local council GE-free zones, which are making us money, billions of dollars of export as our point of difference in the market. This bill has got these mandatory approvals of emergency medical uses of gene technology, and I think it's still in there, the mandatory approval of products that have been approved by 2 other countries overseas. Now, this is really tying the hands of the regulator. It's making New Zealand open to, for want of a better word, dodgy countries approving dodgy things and us having to take it.
I just often wonder how you get here. How do we get here?
Oh, it's a global discussion.
Yeah,
it's a global journey, and we've got here because very powerful forces have got a lot of interest in patents and making money out of GMOs. That's their business. And unfortunately, certainly in the food sector, it's a technology looking for a purpose and a use, but the consumer is very clear. They do not want it. You will definitely sell GMO products, but what GMO products will do for New Zealand will be to drive us into the lowest common denominator, the lowest level of commodity. Because let's be clear, the product successes, in inverted commas, in America and other places, these GM crops which are resistant to Roundup or create an insecticide that kills certain insects, they are ending up in making ethanol, in making animal feed, and be highly processed foods, but they're not ending up in the mainstream food supply except hidden and subvertedly entered into the food supply because the consumer prefers non-GMO. And certainly the consumer's got any option. You will definitely sell GM food cheap. Absolutely. Cheap food sells to poorer people. But that's not the market New Zealand's aiming for. And it's really not right to impose GM food on the public because if you can't afford anything better, that's what you're getting.
So who's really driving this then? Who are some of the major proponents? If we could name some people here, their involvement, who are they?
Well, it's very broad. I mean, within New Zealand, all the Crown Research Institutes have been funded to do this research. The way that the funding of science in New Zealand has been set up, and often under the control of MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Economic Development, that is also overseeing this bill. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest, or more than a bit of a conflict of interest in that combination, because they're directing the bill, but they also direct where the research money goes. And so what's happened is that scientists have been told, well, you can't just do, good science for New Zealand. You've got to have a product. You've got to have a patent. You've got to have this output from the science, supply chain. And so they've all ended up trying to make products that essentially the consumer is certainly wary about gene-edited products because they see them and understand them to be GMOs. But these companies, and our companies, these Crown Research Institutes and their scientists are looking for patents. They're looking to keep their jobs by producing products that can be marketed and sold, especially licensed overseas. But they've got a product line or an innovation line that is contradictory to the food trends globally and where the market wants to go. So that's the enormous conflict. This is a global conflict between highly technologized and more industrialized food production and the opposite of that, which is more diversity, which is more ability for local communities to produce their own food, the ability to produce non-GMO and organic products, regenerative agriculture. All of these things are the opposite to GMOs being brought in to New Zealand.
Because they're all natural solutions versus something that needs to be engineered and allowed to be patented for a commercialization sort of outcome to make money from, right?
This is the nub of it. What we're doing is the money is going into genetic engineering to produce products that essentially are not valued in the market. They will find something, but not at that macro level where the clarity of brand New Zealand today is as a non-GMO producer. All our crops, all our fruit, all our vegetables are non-GMO. And that's an asset both locally but also internationally. Ultimately, it's about this conflict between a vision for how we relate to food, and there's an opportunity cost that's already happening now. The fact that the government didn't do an economic analysis on this bill, the fact that they've ignored the GE-free advantage in our export markets, means that they don't want to pursue that. Now, unfortunately, the market says that's where we need to go to have success in our economy. In a way, that's what our economy is based on currently. This impression, somebody said to me the other day that they spoke to someone and they said, oh, isn't all New Zealand's food organic? And I said, well, unfortunately not. It'd be lovely if it was. But it's certainly regarded as safe. It's certainly regarded as trusted, as non-GMO, natural, clean, green, that kind of pure image that we market ourselves on. And we need to defend that.
I totally agree with you, John. I'm keen to touch on the origins of the bill because there's some shady origins there. And I know some of the cohort at PSGR did a good deep dive on this because there's some really good information in there. But just some of the decisions to strip away principles. I know that the Science and Technology Minister at that time was Judah Collins. She's no longer. It's now Shane Retty, obviously. But is that something you can talk to? Do you know much about that?
A lot of the things that in the bill, sorry to sound contradictory, but a lot of the things that are in the bill are not in the bill. A lot of the concerns, the removal of the precautionary principle, from the papers I've seen, and these are all papers that back up the decisions in Cabinet, was that it was out of fashion. It was old-fashioned. And the reality is that that's, of course, nonsense. But the fact that ministers can be told or ministers can tell officials, let's keep this out of scope, let's say it's out of fashion, is really outrageous. And that's why it needs to come back. As I said, the precautionary principle is a global matter. It says when science and technology are advancing so fast and in a way that penetrates into natural systems so much more than we have done historically, potentially especially, you've got to have some kind of backstop to what we do. And taking away that backstop is almost economic sabotage, because at some point the regulator is going to be approving something that they know, or at least have an intuition that it's going to be damaging to the environment. But their hands are tied because the bill has been designed to enable that, not to prevent it.
Well, they also don't do a lot of safety testing around these things. There's a lot of grand claims, I guess. But is there much safety testing? Or is that bought and paid for science? Regulatory
it's probably a mix of all of those things. There's certainly no monitoring of who's eating GMOs and what the impact was on their health. There have been some food trials in animals and in humans. Only a few have really been completed in humans. So most of the research we know about GM products is from what happens to the animals who eat it. And there's a range of different problems that you can from impacts on organs to the gut biome to fertility. None of these things have been followed up. I mean, just going back to Dr. Arpad Push died 25 years ago, his research was shut down, and the work that he was doing, the products were destroyed, so no one could follow up on the actual potatoes that he was trialing. And a similar thing happened even before that. There was a food supplement incident where people died and were maimed by L-tryptophan produced through genetic engineering. And that was a hoo-ha all over the world. That product was also destroyed. So no one could go back and check whether it was a purification issue or whether it was a change in the genetic makeup of that microorganism being used to make the L-tryptophan. No one could actually know for sure afterwards because the product was destroyed. Now that's historical. Today, the issue is that companies are to be left to decide whether it's safe and is the organism they think it is, for a whole range of new gene-edited products. So the new gene editing, what they call CRISPR, or sometimes just referred to as new breeding techniques or new genomic techniques or precision breeding. These are all words to describe a whole lot of techniques that are about to be deregulated and allowed and the company's left to, the fox is left to watch the chicken house. So one of the arguments from the independent scientists is you cannot exclude these products from the bill, which it does. You have to include them in the bill, have oversight, have traceability of these new products, because they are going to enter the food system if they're allowed to. So that lack of traceability, that lack of independent testing, that lack of labelling is the nub of the issue. Those three things are kind of like the foundations of safe food management. And the food authorities have really betrayed the public. They've sold out to the industry. They've been doing it for quite a while, to be honest, but they've done it big time most recently by saying these products do not need to be labelled because they're so much like nature, and the companies will make sure they're safe and go forth. Now, that's why we've been doing vigils outside of Woolworths and outside of New World and the supermarkets, because FSANZ, the food authorities, have betrayed the public by taking away labelling and the right to choose. And it's for the supermarkets now to use their powers to tell their suppliers they want to maintain a non-GMO policy. They certainly want to maintain the right to choose for their customers, and they want these products labelled and identified in the supermarket. So far, they've said they won't. So far, they've said they obey FSANZ. And let's just be really clear. The FSANZ, the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, have betrayed the public. They have been embedded with industry in these decisions. They made labelling out of scope. So even though thousands of people wrote submissions to say, look, it may be safe, it may not be. You're saying it's safe, it's like nature, but we want the choice. That was made out of scope. That's a very important phrase in our times. Things made out of scope means that the public or anybody saying things can be ignored. So they made labelling out of scope. For the food authorities to do that leaves, as I say, the onus on people like, or organisations like the supermarkets and like the producers like Zespri to be transparent and honest about what they're doing in the marketplace. Now, so far, as I say, the supermarkets are saying they won't. What they say is they will obey FSANZ rules. And today, that's like saying they will obey Monsanto, because Monsanto and Bayer and other companies like that, to answer your question, who's behind it? These are large and local Crown Research Institutes and organisations like Scion. They all want a piece of the action, but they need to understand that the social contract is, well, if you want that action, you cannot transfer the costs to the public and other producers, and you cannot take away the right to choose. And unfortunately, that's really what's happening. So I'm hoping the supermarkets will respect their customers and actually allow them the choice. But today, supermarkets are saying no, they're just going to obey Monsanto.
Well, when I look at that, the consumer is not benefiting out of that. They're losing information. They're not aware of what they're eating. The only people who are benefiting is big food companies.
Correct.
Hiding genetically modified organisms in their products.
The one argument that the minister at the time, when FSANZ was taking away the labelling, he said, well, you can still have a choice. You can go and buy organic. Now, look, I mean, that's ideal, but it's not realistic for many people. The second thing, he says, well, labelling things costs money. So by not labelling GMOs, your food will be cheaper. That's not the argument made by the food industry in Europe. The contrast between Woolworths and Foodstuffs, which is the owners of New World and Pam's and Pack and Save here, and Woolworths, which was Countdown, but now Woolworths. The argument from those organisations is that currently they've got quite good non-GMO policies for their own products, but there's changes in the rules means that unless they voluntarily labelling it, people will have no right to choose. That whole stance by the food industry here, or rather those supermarkets, is in real contrast to what's going on in Europe. In Europe, the supermarkets have stood up for their customers. They've written to the European Union to say, look, you've got to maintain traceability and choice in the market for non-GMO and to label these products. And they're pushing, the debate's still going on there, but they've stood up for the customer. And I'd love Woolworths and Foodstuffs to stand up for New Zealand customers too.
Wouldn't we all? For those that don't, very new to GMOs, you've got gene editing now, this CRISPR technology. For a layperson, what's the difference between those two definitions?
Okay, so gene technology encompasses a whole lot of things. In fact, you hear people say, we've been using gene technology for thousands of years by crossing this plant with that plant. What we're talking about is new technologies that emerge over the last 15 to 20 years. They continue to advance. They are lab-based changes to the genetic makeup of animals, plants, microbes, viruses, bacteria. So they're lab-based changes that override, kind of piggyback on natural systems, but kind of override them, whereas traditional breeding has always been a coherent thing. There is a kind of midpoint whereby you can use, and I support this, it's called marker-assisted breeding, where you look at the genome of an organism to see features that might be of benefit in terms of production. And then you identify those genes in certain animals or plants, and then you cross them and crossbreed them, but without using genetic engineering. So you've used genetic engineering to read the genes, but not to alter them. Now, the argument today is that we can go in and just alter them. Why spend time crossbreeding something when you can just go in and fix up the issue that you want to fix? Now, that's where the scientific debate is landed. Some people are saying, well, we know so much now that we can just go in and tinker with this gene, and they do not need to be regulated because that could have happened in nature, but it didn't happen in nature. And the issue from a scientific point of view is that technology is so powerful. Gene technology and gene editing can actually override the natural defenses and repair systems of an organism to change things that traditional breeding wouldn't change. Mutagenesis, scrambling of genes with other chemicals or radiation, couldn't change because the organism would repair itself and defend those bits of the genome. Gene editing can go in and change those too. We're talking about, with great power comes responsibility. And unfortunately, the deal through the Gene Technology Bill and the food authorities is, well, don't you worry about your responsibility. We're assuming these things that don't even exist yet are going to be safe because we believe the technology is safe. That there's no foundation. Every event can be different. The argument for years has been a case-by-case assessment is the best way forward. And let's be really clear, that's what most public would say, oh, maybe it's okay, but, as long as you're checking it and I've got the right to choose. The right to choose is being taken away. That checking, that assumption of safety is also being taken away. Sorry, the assumption of safety is coming in, and that case-by-case checking is being taken away.
So just so I'm clear, for the definitions of like what a GMO traditionally is understood as, it's a genetically modified organism, could be a plant or any organism, right? But you've added DNA at that point. Whereas gene editing, they're saying we've not added any DNA, so it's not different from nature.
And the scientific argument is that the techniques of transgenics and moving DNA between one species and another can be different from what gene editing does. But the process of gene editing also uses certain processes that may be contaminated with extraneous genes. So even though you think you're just changing the genes within an organism, some of the processes used to do that can actually accidentally introduce genes into that organism, even though you thought they weren't going to be there. And we've got an example of that. I mean, if anyone Googles, I think it's hornless cows have dodgy DNA or something like that. They launched in America a gene-edited cow without horns, and a lot of fanfare to say we've got this gene editing down. We've done it, mate. We can do this. It was only after it was on the market that some extraneous DNA from other organisms, including antibiotic resistance bacteria, were found to be in this cow. So they withdrew it, and they fixed those things up, as I understand it, by removing these unexpected genes. The fact that they were on the market with unexpected genes in a new gene-edited product should be a wake-up call to everybody to say we need to check. You cannot leave it to the companies to do this.
I agree. GMOs and MBTs, bit misleading language there. Could you just explain the difference?
So what the debate from the industry is that because these techniques are not transgenic, although they can be, but because in essence they're trying to go in and change the genes that are already there by silencing them or deleting them or adding or turning them on, because it's not mixing species, there's no worry. Now again, the science doesn't say that. The science says it almost doesn't really matter where a gene comes from. It's what happens in the genome. And going back to gene editing, these new breeding techniques, these new genomic techniques, this precision breeding, these techniques are argued to be safer and of no issue for the public or the food industry because they're not transgenic. But gene editing is highly efficient. When it changes a sequence within an organism, it will change every sequence within that organism. And if you're not in a sterile environment, which you should be, if anything else is in that environment, by accident, it will change those sequences for there in those organisms too. So you've got the potential power of gene editing, but also a kind of relative ease today because it is much easier than in the past. People may be tempted to do these experiments outside of full containment labs. Now, I know the industry is saying, oh, of course you couldn't do that. It takes a lot of effort to do this. It takes a lot of effort to get it right, but you can play around. You can do things. I mean, literally, you can buy kits over the internet that will allow you to do gene sequencing. You can order bits of gene sequencing over the internet. So the availability of these techniques and technologies to non-experts, or to people, companies who are startups thinking that, we can do this, how exciting. That is giving a whole new level of risk exposure because the powerful technologies are being able to be used by organizations that may not be responsible in future, maybe trying to pull a fast one, maybe an overseas company looking at New Zealand as a soft touch if our regulations are relaxed, saying, well, we can't do it here. Well, we can do it in little old New Zealand because they've given up on their legislation to protect them.
Okay. An argument that's often given is this coexistence argument that, you can have GMOs over here on this farm and that's all contained over there. And then we can have organic farms. We can both live in harmony with each other. But that doesn't seem to be, that's a misleading statement, I think. So could you maybe elaborate on that?
So certainly that argument is put forward because some of these enormous countries like Brazil and America and Argentina are kind of like trying to have it both ways. America has got organic producers as well as large expanses of GM crops, etc. But the argument is a furphy, or how can I say, it's misleading. Mm-hmm. Because, number one, New Zealand isn't a large landmass where you've got these huge separations of hundreds of thousands of miles in some cases. But also, it's simply not true. In Australia, the market for non-GMO canola has been quite successful. At the same time, they've introduced GM canola into the Australian supply chain. What happened is that now, what was GE-free canola, called non-GMO canola, has to accept 5% contamination with GE canola because they can't keep it separate. So there is no completely free GE-free canola out of Australia. So I'm not saying there isn't any, but the coexistence strategy is based on you've got to have contamination. So let's think about that. So year one, you've got GE-free crops and you've got potentially this new crop, whatever it may be. Year two, you've got almost GE-free crops. Maybe year two or maybe year three, you've got GE-free crops with even a little bit of contamination, so they're not really GE-free anymore. You could still maybe legally label them as non-GMO because they've only got a little bit of contamination in year three. In year four, they've got a little bit more contamination. As long as less, according to the canola market in Australia, as long as it's less than 5%, you can still say it's non-GMO. Year eight, it's 6%, 10%. Whatever that level of contamination that has to be allowed takes away the right to have non-GMO food in that category. And that's what we've seen in soy. Soy has been contaminated all over the world. So now, if you want to produce non-GMO soy or want to have non-GMO soy in your product, you need to have identity preservation almost from the field to when it comes into your factory. And a lot of companies have done that over the last 10 or 15 years. Companies like Sanitarium, who use a lot of soy, they have created a supply chain to try and keep the GE soy out of their ingredients with a lot of effort and some costs. And I guess ultimately, GE soy has become very prevalent. If it's not identity preserved, if it's not organic, it will be GE.
So they could not export canola. So Australia is an example. They could not export canola now, technically as being 100% natural.
Well, to be honest, canola's got a bit of a shadow over it. I spoke to someone the other day and they were saying, well, it's not good for you anyway. Look, it's a different debate.
Yeah.
But essentially, interestingly, what's happened this year is that the non-GMO canola planting has gone down. Now, it's a bit late because the GM canola has gone down, plantings. People are moving in Australia, more farmers are wanting non-GMO canola. But the system's already contaminated. So to some extent, over time, if the market stops growing GM canola, that level of contamination, I guess, will come down. But that's something that we haven't had to face in New Zealand.
No.
We haven't had it. And in a way, that's one of the problems for New Zealand. We've had it too good. We've had really strict regulations. Yes, FSANs have allowed food ingredients to come in under the radar, but our main crops and our main food, when you go to the supermarket and it's grown in New Zealand, you know it's non-GMO, you know it's not gene edited. That's about to be changed on the public unless we speak up and stop that now.
Yeah, it's definitely important we all speak up because, as most people know, once it's here, there's no putting it back. Absolutely. On that note, I want to move into, there's a lot of people who comment on our videos and they say, oh, it's already here. We've already had releases. I think there's been an example of the potatoes. I can't remember where, but there's a GMO potato example. I know there's GE pine trees in Rotorua, if I'm not mistaken, which I think if most people knew that, they'd be like, what? That's insane. Yeah, could you maybe elaborate on a few of those examples? I'm just curious to pick your brains on them.
So
GE already being here, I guess.
There was a ban on GMO releases just shortly after the Royal Commission in the early 2000s. But after that, the ban was lifted automatically. It had a sunset clause in the prohibition on GMOs that just quietly lapsed about a year or two afterwards. So at that point, and since then, we're talking about the last 15 years, 20 years almost, companies have been allowed to apply for GMO release. They haven't, but they have been approved to do lots of experiments. And there's a dark history of experiments in New Zealand that many of the public don't know. And of course, the officials are saying, oh, we've never done anything like this. This is all new. Now, it goes way back. I mean, there's a history of field trials of G. tamarillas in Northland, where the netting was insufficient to keep it contained. There were experiments with GM salmon. Again, the netting wasn't efficient enough to contain the eggs. There were experiments with GE cows, where the animals had to be euthanized because the experiments were causing the calves' ovaries to develop and expand, and they were kind of rupturing, and so they had to be euthanized. There's other experiments that we can talk about, but those experiments have been somewhat behind closed doors. There are annual reports showing enormous animal suffering that most New Zealanders would say, why the hell are we doing that? I hope that Ag Research, who were doing those trials, have moderated to some extent what they've been doing, perhaps not. But what we're about to do is allow much more of that to be done behind closed doors, out of public sight. And those trials, as I say, have not contaminated our food system widely. There is no widespread contamination from those trials that I'm aware of. The food system has maintained its integrity. There's a zero threshold allowance for GM contamination in imported seed. Now, you can't test every seed, and of course, there's always risk of contamination, but the effort's there. A lot of what we're talking about is best efforts by companies, by growers, by food suppliers to do the best to keep GMOs out, to keep the integrity of their food. They're always up against it. This is the battle. So that's what we're fighting for, is to maintain the integrity of the food system without having to have forced contamination of GMOs. But today we do not have that. So I really challenge people. One of the things that might be confusing to people is that we've been crossbreeding animals for thousands of years, and for many, many years, industry said, look, why are you worried about genetic engineering? Because we've been modifying animals for thousands of years. So it's nothing different here. And of course, it is different. It's a deceptive thing to say this is the same as traditional breeding. It's not. But that has made people think, oh, those pioneer crops that say, corn's growing. Pioneer were very big on GMOs and probably still are. And when they saw pioneer signs along the road on corn growing in fields, I think at the time they thought, oh, it's here, they've done it. But they didn't do it, as far as I'm aware. If they have done it, it would be absolutely criminal.
Yeah. So I think the point, I guess, to make is that we've not had wide-scale commercial release of genetically modified organisms, like on an industrial scale, like we've seen in America and other places.
Correct.
Yeah.
In fact, there's no release of no commercial release has been allowed in New Zealand. Now, again, it doesn't mean that contamination may have not happened here and there. But, I mean, this is the really key. I think there's an effort to disable the public, both by leaving them unaware of this bill at all, making them feel, oh, look, it's okay, they must know what they're doing. The GMOs are going to save us from all the challenges of the world, so why not give it a go? But there's not only the opportunity cost for the alternatives that are being ignored and sidelined, but you've also got this disabling the public by making them think they've got no power, they've got no choice, it's all over. And it's not just in the food industry that's going on. But as far as I'm aware, let me reassure people, that our mainstream food supply is predominantly non-GMO. All our products grown here in terms of fruit, vegetables, crops are non-GMO. And the big thing is that that's an economic asset. Apart from being what consumers want, is an economic asset because overseas consumers want non-GMO too.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. We maybe skipped over this point, but I want to touch on it around like this hybridization in plant breeding over many generations, because a lot of people seem to assume that seedless grapes, for example, are GMO.
Yeah.
But they're not, right?
It's very interesting. I had a call from a journalist not that long ago, and they were talking about the tearless onions that Woolworths had launched in their supermarket. And they talked about the red kiwi fruit and saying, look, these are all gene edited, and why are you worried about the removal of labelling, I think we were talking about. And I had to explain to him that even he, and good on this journalist, and he did hear it and then went away and found out, but the red kiwi fruit is not genetically engineered. It's traditional breeding. As I understand it, so too are the tearless onions. There were projects doing GMO tearless onions over the years, but these products, as I understand it, and the journalist did check, these are from traditional breeding, possibly using marker-assisted breeding to see what genes they might want to alter. But there's a big difference between traditionally bred products with innovation. And my concern is that Zespri, and I have to call out Zespri here because they've had an enormous success. They are a major exporter for New Zealand, and they've kind of stayed faith with the consumer globally by knowing people don't want GMOs and keeping their innovation pipeline non-GMO to the traditional crossbreeding. They're tempted by the gene editing process, and perhaps they can move forward in that. But one of the things that one of their head honchos said at the select committee for the gene technology bill is, we've had enormous success. I mean, this is a nightmare for me to hear this. We've had this enormous success meeting the market demand for naturally bred food, but innovation, the red kiwi fruit, gold kiwi fruit. But we're thinking of moving into gene editing because it's just an extension of natural breeding. Now, when I heard that, it really made me worried because these are marketers, these are leaders of companies, and Zespri's had this enormous success as a clean, green, natural kind of food producer exporting to the world. To make this migration into gene editing on the basis that it's just like traditional breeding is completely wrong, not only scientifically, but from a marketing point of view, because the consumers all over the world, when they know when they're asked, what is the difference between genetic engineering, gene editing, traditional breeding, they see it very clearly. They say, gene editing is GMOs, very, very clearly. It's in the lab. It's tinkering with genes without that holistic crossbreeding, natural kind of process, which is much more complex than going in and changing one gene. So to have that comment made at the select committee really rang alarm bells. And I hope that if they do move into gene editing, which I think would be a mistake, certainly from a layman's point of view, they've got to be transparent. They've got to reveal that they're no longer being traditionally bred leaders in the world. They've gone into the gene editing market and they need to disclose that a product is gene edited. Now, whether they do that or not, they're certainly not required to. It's about the integrity of their company. Zespri is like other companies from New Zealand, the shop window of New Zealand produce. And if they drop this ball and introduce gene editing and lose their really strong claim for natural food, because let's be really clear, gene editing is not a natural process. Traditional breeding is a natural process, gene editing is something else, and to try and pretend they're the same is misleading and is unscientific, and it is what is going on.
I mean, Zespri, if you're listening, I love your kiwi fruit. I don't want to eat unnatural kiwi fruit. I want to eat pure food, not gene-edited or GMO food, whatever definition you want to put on it.
Well,
I feel uncomfortable about it.
Cal, get in line with all the hundreds and thousands of millions, probably, of people all over the world who agree with you.
Yeah, let's hope they're listening. So if you're listening, take note. I wanted to touch on as well what meat eaters out there probably not too cognizant, or maybe they are, of what their food is being fed. And there's obviously a lot of animal feed here imported is genetically engineered, genetically modified. That has many questions around like our food integrity, because does that mean that's labelled then? That if you're eating meat in the supermarket, how do I know if that's been what's it been fed? Has it lived a healthy life?
Well, it goes back to trusted brands, trusted suppliers. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a conflict going on within industry. So, for example, Fonterra do not allow, as I understand it, a new product available globally called Bovier, which is a feed additive supposedly to reduce methane. That's that's coming into the market globally, causing a lot of concern from consumers and the market. But Fonterra said that don't use that. But as far as I'm aware, they haven't said to their farmers, you also must not use imported distillers' grain from America as a cheap feed. And that's GMO. Now, they may have some farmers that they've told you can't use that. Certainly organic and what they're exporting to America, they'd be saying, oh, don't use this animal feed for these products, this milk, because that's not allowed. We're marketing it as non-GMO. But when it's not being marketed as clearly as non-GMO with a non-GMO project label, some Fonterra milk may well be from animals fed GMO crops imported from America. Certainly palm expella husks, which are non-GMO, but they're also a waste product that's maybe not ideal. Our dairy industry, unfortunately, says it's grass-fed, but it needs other feed to supplement it, and has gone for some of the cheaper options rather than the quality options. So again, it's that missed opportunity for New Zealand to be producing its own feed, its own fodder, to maintain a kind of integrity of our reputation globally by allowing cheap, nasty stuff to come into our food chain. Same goes with chickens. Chicken feed, unless it's produced by a supplier that actively maintains non-GMO supplies or organic, will likely have GM soy in it. And this has been a debate over the years. And unfortunately, again, that choice has been steadily taken away. If you've got some chickens in your backyard and you're buying in feed, unless you're finding a few suppliers that do not use GMO, the chances are GM soy is going to be in that animal feed. Now, the issue has been, does that transfer into the food? And the argument from a technical point of view is no, these products will not transfer into the meat or the milk of the animal, so it's okay, don't worry about it. It's one of those hidden uses of GM behind the scenes. There's not a lot of testing with these products to see what the impacts are on the animals, to see what comes through in the milk. Fonterra know this. They know that they're not going to play absolute Russian roulette with their products. So I know, or I believe I know, that they will have a supply chain that doesn't use these things. But the fact that the rest of their supply chain may is a vulnerability to Fonterra. It's a vulnerability to our export reputation. And ultimately, especially as more and more gene-edited products potentially come onto the market and get lost in the system, not traced, not regulated, you're going to have a nightmare of Fonterra and other companies actually being able to guarantee what they're producing. So that's actually, sorry to use actually so much, but that is why even companies like Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ at the select committee, even though they stood up and said, oh, look, we support the idea of this bill to relax the rules because we've got some patents behind the scenes and we've got some ideas up in the back drawer. They all said after that, good on you, government, for doing this, but you can't allow untraced, unregulated gene-edited products into the system because we won't know what we're doing. And I think pretty much that's the message at the select committee, is that even for the industries wanting it, apart from the biotech industry itself, they're saying we've got to have regulation, you've got to have control and traceability and some kind of structure around, if you're going to do this, some structure around it. And that structure is not in place. So going back to MPs, whether it's New Zealand First MPs, all MPs should be standing up for this. I mean, seriously, all MPs should not be allowing this bill to go forward if it looks like it does now. If it changes dramatically, then it's a different discussion. So the heads up is that next week when that select committee report back, unless those major changes are in that bill, if it's been a bit of tinkering around the edge, not good enough. And again, the public would just say not acceptable in New Zealand.
Okay. I also want to touch on cheese. People love cheese. And the GE rennet debate, there's a few in our cohort that have been trying to understand which producers use GE rennet, and there's a lot of dancing around in the language and the responses that we were getting, which seems, to be honest, a little bit curious. But what do you know about the GE rennet? What can you share anything about that?
I wish I knew for certain, but all I can do is report what we've heard back from suppliers. They've all been very cautious to actually reveal what they're using and to claim it's non-GMO. They do say it's non-GMO, but they don't give a lot of details as to, well, what is it? But apparently, certainly, let's be really clear, if it's organic, it will not be GMO rennet. If it's conventional, then it's about the brand you're buying. And certainly Fonterra, for some of their brands, I can't remember which ones, they say they use a non-GMO fungus-derived rennet. But we also know traditional animal rennet, which if you're a vegetarian you may not be into, but it was also used by some companies. The ones that are using the GMO-derived version, because of the Fazan's rules, because they follow Fazan's Bayer Monsanto rules, they don't have to reveal it. And I think a lot of people, it goes back to that disabling the public by saying, look, it's all over the place, it's already in your food, why are you complaining? And it's true that there may be many derived products and artificial ingredients, artificial additives and things that do not have to be revealed and do not have to be labelled, and really companies can get away with it. But that's when you go back to brand. Brands that are betraying their customers by doing stuff behind the scenes should not be supported, if you can find that out. And that's why you need to ask brands, and that's true for everybody. I would encourage people, if you want to know, ask. Don't rely on somebody else asking. You ask and see what they reply. But you're absolutely right. They dance around the subject. One of the reasons why they dance around the subject is there's a lot of fear in the industry to make a claim and then get caught out. So over the years, you don't see a lot of non-GMO labelling in New Zealand because it is regarded as a guarantee of purity. And if you're even a little bit contaminated, which the system is allowed to happen globally, for example in soy, you will be potentially taken away under the Fair Trading Act and charged. And that happened to a company called Bean Supreme. They had a little logo on their product, I think 15 years ago, maybe longer, and a small amount of contamination was identified. So they were not non-GMO, they were non-GMO but had been contaminated. I think it was like 0.1% of the product. Now, the industry, I think there's an intentional chilling effect on industry. Don't talk about being non-GMO. And if you do, we're going to hold you to a very high standard. And if you get contaminated accidentally, you're going to be for it. And that's what happened to Bean Supreme. They were charged and they had to take their logo off because they couldn't guarantee it's non-GMO. Now, I don't believe that companies should be forced to not talk about their effort to be GE-free, even if they may be contaminated. So there is a website called GE-freepolicy.com. And that's been set up to support companies. And the whole purpose of that site says, to say you've got a GE-free policy or a non-GMO policy cannot be a guarantee, certainly for things like soy, because the contamination's been allowed. So it's best efforts. It's the identity preserved supply chain. It's that we only buy organic that could also be contaminated, but best efforts to secure your supply chain. And that's what we need companies to live up to. At the moment, they can get away with being dodgy and hiding the use of gene-edited or genetically engineered ingredients if they don't have to be labelled, because Fazan's says they don't have to be labelled. I guess the big change now is that Fazan's say whole foods won't have to be labelled just because they've been gene-edited, but with these exempted processes. Exempted processes that, as I say, are not like nature. They're just being assumed to be safe. These products are not in the market. So they're literally assuming these future products that they've never seen are going to be safe, and they're leaving the companies to make sure they're safe. And it's based on things like, there's a thing called null segregants where plants are crossed. GE may be used earlier on, but they've outcrossed the plants, so there's no GE left. Now, again, experts like Professor Jack Heinemann have said, look, is it a null segregant? You've said, you've crossbred all these genetic elements out, but have you? Who's going to validate that? And what are the implications, even if you have removed them, of that process to the safety of that product? You can't leave it to the companies. We've got a history of companies left to be self-adjudicating on safety and efficiency, and that history is not good. Companies are driven by profit. They make compromises to get products to market. That's why the GE hornless cow ended up on the market. Gung-ho, get it out there, get our patents in place, get our visibility. And just briefly, let's talk about this promise of success for New Zealand if we do adopt it, because otherwise we're going to be left behind. There's very few successful gene-edited products. We know what the GMO products are, the mainstream existing ones like the herbicide-resistant crops. But the gene-edited products that have come into the market, certainly in America, do not seem to have been successful. Over 100 have been approved with a kind of rubber stamp. These are like nature, you can go ahead. There was again, it's not necessarily gene editing, it's also lab grown. It's all part of the industrialization and technologizing of food. But a couple of years ago, with big fanfare, they launched in New York restaurants a lab grown chicken. And they launched it in Flash New York restaurant because it gave it an aura of quality and respectability. It's no longer on sale, as far as I can see. Australia just approved GE quail, lab-grown quail. I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but maybe.
Oh, it sounds disgusting.
The people who were making GM salmon in Canada went bankrupt. But a new company in America is just launching lab-grown salmon created by cellular agriculture. Now, all of these things connect because they're using gene technologies to adapt microbes to produce the products they want in vats, not in a natural system, but in vats of microorganisms purified. And that process has always been known to have challenges. One, they can't really scale it up cost efficiently. So these lab-grown salmon, I think, cost hundreds of dollars to make this little salmon. There's risks of contamination in the inputs into these vat-grown products. And then it's just going back to the L-tryptophan story way back. Things can emerge in the vats, things can go wrong. Contamination and the lack of purity in these highly complex systems, especially as you scale them up, is really difficult to assure against. So that's why I've said that you can't argue against companies like Daisy Lab wanting to develop artificial milk in the lab, but you can certainly argue against people wanting to not drink it or support people who say, I don't want it.
Yeah. I want to maybe move the conversation along to talk about taxpayer money. We want to know where our taxes are going. Oh, I do anyway. I'm always reminded that saying, follow the money. There's obviously a lot of economic risks, in my view, with the bill on how we're perceived on a world stage for our exports. But is there anything you can tell me about, I guess, some of the GE3's work in your official information requests? I'm sure you've got some juicy details in there around some of the taxpayer money that's been spent on any of these experiments in the past.
As I said, the whole setup of the scientific community pipeline is, don't worry about pure science. You make a product, you get a patent, we'll try and market it. So the whole kind of setup is, technology looking for a market, looking for an output, looking for some kind of profit stream. And that's the way, unfortunately, New Zealand's scientific research setup has become drawn into. So let's take the GE ryegrass experiments with ag research. I think it's been going on for about 15 to maybe even 20 years. It's many tens of millions, like probably $20, $30 million of public funding. There's also a lot of patents which may accrue to public profit, but I suspect will go to other kind of compatriot companies or even the scientists themselves making a clip on the ticket if they have a patent that gets some success. But the GE ryegrass is the best example of what's wrong with our thinking and the processes in place. There's been no success from that GE ryegrass. There's arguments that our rules have been so strict that we had to go to America to do the trials. But if you look at the results of those trials, they're not stellar. In fact, they're very poor that they couldn't actually produce enough feed to do feeding trials. So over 20 years of this research, until probably 6 months ago, not one animal had ever been fed this experimental product to see what happens to the milk or the animal who consumes it. That's just happened with, I think it was 12 lambs fed dried fodder produced out of pots planted in a glass house to grow this grass to test them on the animals. They did go to Australia as well to do other trials of GE ryegrasses, and those applications had to be pulled because the regulators said, look, we're not going to approve this because we think there's a suspected food allergen in this product, the ryegrass they are trying, because they put a sesame seed gene in, and some people are allergic to sesame. So they told the ag research and other people, look, go away, get rid of the sesame gene, come back with a new application and we'll be happier with it. The potential of new allergens isn't just because you put an allergenic gene in. There's a potential of new allergens to produce through gene editing and genetic engineering processes generally, which is why you need to check. And to leave the companies to check, to not have regulation, again, opens up that risk for eternity if you say we're not going to regulate it.
Yeah, why would they check if it's going to cost them money? And ultimately maybe open a few doors they didn't want to open.
Yeah, so the ryegrass is one example. The ag research animals is another example where a lot of effort's been made to reduce methane. But let's be really clear, the alternatives, there's an opportunity cost. About 15 years ago, Dairy NZ did research showing that mixed forage, a mixture of different plants, in animal feed would reduce methane by 30%, maintain animal health and production. But I believe because it can't be patented, that they've kind of sidelined it, and only a few farmers are doing that. Certainly organic and regenerative farmers, I've learned that lesson, are doing that. But the mainstream farmers have not been offered this opportunity. They're being told monoculture ryegrass. If you're worried about methane, here's another ryegrass, monoculture ryegrass. And we know that's not the right way. So the opportunity cost for these investments and these patents is that we're missing the opportunity to actually align New Zealand production with a more natural, sustainable, ethical marketing position, which is what we own today and should be living up to as far as we can moving forward.
20 years ago, this was a real big issue for a lot of people. There was 30-odd thousand people in the street in Auckland who marched and actually saw that GE-free banner that we've got in that video. But the awareness is very different now. It maybe is getting out in the media a little bit more, seeing a few more stories in the mainstream, which is good. It's more encouraging. I guess at large, my view is the public perception is very loose on this issue. They don't have too much information about it, or most people don't even know what a GMO is. Would that be your kind of view as well, that there's this real lack of awareness now compared to 20 years ago?
I think there's a mixture of levels of awareness, like anything, I guess. What happened in New Zealand is because there was a kind of civil victory after the Royal Commission that said move forward cautiously, set up a bioethics council. There was about, I can't remember, 30, 40 recommendations, some of which were taken up, most of which were sidelined. Certainly the bioethics council was abolished. But what the situation is that we've been lulled into a sense of security because we've had no GMOs growing in the field. The stuff that has been entering the food system is hidden. The animal feed people don't know about. And it's not all animal feed, it's some. It's this encroachment into the integrity of our food system that's been happening. But because that's happened behind the scenes and at relatively low levels compared with, say, America, the market spoke. So the consumer didn't have to worry about it because the market had spoken, apart from these like slightly dodgy importations of things that have been approved by FSANs. And because the market spoke, most of the big reputable companies have kept out GE ingredients that they would have to label or disclose. So there isn't anything visible to respond to. And now, with this future trajectory being proposed by the Gene Technology Bill, they want to make sure that even as these new products come in, there's still nothing to respond to because it won't be labelled and disclosed. So this is the really tragic time that we're in, because the consumer spoke. Now they've been lulled to be reassured that our food system is safe. Meanwhile, rearguard action by industry to hijack this bill and get what they want in this bill means that all those fundamentals of the right to choose and traceability and knowing what's in our food are being taken away. And I believe that anybody over 25 or 30 will be aware way back that we had that battle. Some might have thought we lost that battle, as you're saying, oh, it's everywhere, but it's not, as far as I'm aware. Others will be like, well, as you say, what is it? What's arriving? And haven't we been doing that for thousands of years? And what's the difference? Oh, well, this is not GMOs. This is gene editing. And as I try to explain, these are all part of the gene technology capabilities. They are all different from traditional breeding. They are not like nature. They can certainly potentially have unexpected allergens, unexpected changes in a product that need to be checked and validated. And the public, as I say, they were on holiday at Christmas, hopefully, most of them. They weren't thinking about this gene technology bill. I still meet people that have no idea about it, have no idea about one of the most significant bills this country has ever had before Parliament. The media, in terms of the mainstream, have towed the line to some extent by saying, oh, well, no, it's just a technological bill, and look at something else, well, let's not talk about it. It's very complex. Except it's not complex. The public are stuck between scientists in industry saying one thing and independent scientists globally saying another thing. And we need to find the middle path for New Zealand and the right to choose. And that middle path is being subverted by this bill. And that's why the public need to be aware that whilst it's been very great that New Zealand's been GE-free all these years, if we want that choice, if we want to defend our export point of difference, we've got to fight and we've got to support the politicians who will speak up for New Zealand.
On that note, NZ First have publicly come out and said that they're not going to support that bill based on a few of those safeguards that are not in the bill existing. So we'll see where that goes. But 20 years ago, the Greens were a very big player, I guess, in pushing back on the bill. Where are they now is my question, though. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This issue has always been bigger than any one political party. And in a way, the fact that New Zealand First, the Labour Party members received this recent petition to stop the bill. The Green MP, Steve Abel, stood also on the platform at Parliament welcoming this public petition to stop the bill and have a public inquiry. There's actually enormous... I've met National Party people who are also aware of this issue for many years and know that their party's kind of pushing something that may not be in the public interest. But they haven't got the guts to cross the floor. I wish they did. The Green Party, like every party, especially National and ACT, have got people saying, look, this is going to save our planet. This is going to change the world. And it's going to... And you don't want to be too sarcastic and say, well, we've had these promises for 30 years. Where is the evidence that this is going to be true? To be fair, the technology is so much easier and so much more accessible that you can't necessarily say there won't be better products into the future. But it certainly doesn't mean you don't regulate them, you don't maintain safety and segregation of those products. The Green Party, therefore, has got, and other parties have got this debate going on. But what they do know is that the nature and those missed opportunities for more natural farming, more natural agriculture, which is what the markets want, and which the Green Party has always held as fundamentals to their principles, that needs to be protected and maintained. And so I think, in a way, the Greens are no different from every other party. They've got a range of views, but what they do know is protecting non-GMO production, protecting the environment from contamination, and protecting the right to choose in our export markets as non-GMO need to be in place. And again, it's for all MPs to speak up and say, well, those three things that I just mentioned, we've got to have them in place. And they're not in this bill. This bill contradicts those fundamentals, and we cannot support it.
Yeah, it feels to me like when I watch a lot of the old Greens footage back in those protests in those days, it's very different, very, very different. Maybe they've lost their environmental roots a little bit. I can guess they can fall for this. They're being sold on the idea it's going to be something great to solve climate change, that we're going to use genetically engineer our way out of climate change. So I can understand they've maybe got that in their mind, but...
Or lab-grown food, lab-grown meat that will reduce animal husbandry and use of animal meat. These are all philosophical discussions. They're about our future vision of the world. Sorry, I'll just say that again, knocking the mic. It's about our future vision of the world and how we relate to food and how we produce food. And there's going to be multiple futures. The GMO agriculture in America ain't going to disappear. I mean, it might slowly, actually, but at the end of the day, we've got to protect what we've got now in terms of an economic asset and the integrity of our food system. Whatever the promises on the never, never, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. The only economic analysis of the asset that New Zealand has today as a non-GMO exporter was done only about 4 or 5 months ago. It wasn't government-led, and it showed up to $20 billion worth of economic advantage annually from being this clean, green, non-GMO exporter. So anything that puts that at risk is a threat to our economy. The government did no economic analysis on this bill. They didn't consult with the farmers and the exporters. That's why they're getting the pushback now. And it comes to a head next week, on the 22nd of August, what comes out of the Select Committee. If it continues, essentially, the hijack of this bill and allows it to continue, then we're in big trouble, because our economy relies on living up to what we are seen to be internationally, not walking away from that.
Yeah, well, it's incredibly risky when you understand that New Zealand's economy is largely an agricultural one. It's got 24% of its exports, I think, are in dairy. That's a big number. So when the news gets out that New Zealand is no longer a GMO natural food producing country, and we're like everyone else.
This goes back to that coexistence. Even if we were, 20 times bigger than the landmass we are, and we wanted to have both, there's something about New Zealand, and it goes back to brand New Zealand. And it's about the impressions of people, both here, but also internationally, about what we are and what we're like. And in terms of branding, clarity, consistency, authenticity, honesty are all kind of key pillars to a successful brand, and also putting the consumer at the heart of your endeavour. All of those things need to be part and have been part of our, New Zealand Inc. kind of image to the world. We need to we need to navigate a middle path. And I'd argue we've had that middle path. There has been no ban on GMOs. There has been regulation and strict. We haven't had releases. We have had ethical medicine going on, with insulin, etc., and T-cell cells research. So we've actually seemed to have done the right thing in the world for the last 20 years. And if that is abandoned, that clarity and honesty will progressively dilute. It won't necessarily happen overnight, but it will be the first incident of contamination, the first instance of our product exported and finding gene contamination being rejected by Europe or Japan or another country. That will be the start of the slow unravelling, maybe rapid unravelling of our point of difference in the market. Now, the point of difference, what they call in marketing, you call it like a USP, unique sales proposition, or your value proposition. That's what we're fighting for. New Zealand has got a value proposition in the market. Maybe we're not 100% pure, but in terms of our relative point of difference and superiority to commodities out of America and Argentina, that needs to be defended. That is keeping our economy going. And I say it to Christopher Luxon. He said to me a couple of years ago at Field Days, GE is going to make us rich. Well, the dream is, the promise is. No evidence of it doing that in America. Lots of biotechnology companies, startups have actually gone under. It's the public funding that you mentioned that's propping up to some extent the industry in collaboration with private funding. But if we do not defend our GMO-free or non-GMO export advantage, it will be a betrayal of New Zealand. It will be a betrayal and undermine our economy. If they want to have both, then let us have both. But we cannot have unregulated gene editing through this gene technology bill at the cost of what we have today, our point of difference in the market, our reputation as safe, our marketing of food as natural, our choice in the system to avoid GMOs. That can't be taken away, and we mustn't allow it to be taken away.
No, it's a gamble. It's a gamble of everyone's pockets here as well. Our whole economy will balance on that status that we all benefit from. I agree. We're at a very historical crossroads, I think. I mean, it's kind of like history repeating. What do they say? History rhymes, not repeats. Yeah, but I'll probably end it up there, John. Or maybe one thing, actually, maybe just to touch on what people can do right now, the actions you can take. You can still speak to your MPs. Anything else, John, people can do in terms of information?
Email, phone, text, or write to your MP. All MPs, they all need to know that this is going to come before Parliament. If you know them individually, this is a human thing. One thing we haven't talked about, except in passing, is that I've always argued about there being a difference between inside and outside, about contained ethical uses and external release. And that issue is coming to a head because not only have we got that section in the bill, which is the mandatory emergency medical use. So I've always said, look, the medicines is a different topic. It raises different issues. But today, because of the recent history of we've seen how technology can be, to some extent, imposed into communities because of concerns globally of pandemic or whatever else, I'm no longer so convinced that the internal medical uses can be left without an ethical oversight. So I once was, but I'm thinking even the medical debate does need to have a lens applied to it which has got ethics within it. But at the end of the day, that is contained. It is not universally spread through our food system and all blowing through the field. The technology is advancing whereby they can actually do gene editing in the field. There are new pesticides being developed and being used in America initially now, whereby they're using genetic constructs in the field to silence genes within a plant or within an insect. Now, that external use of gene technology is one of the things that Professor Jack Heinemann has really spoken up against. He says you may have a product of gene technology that can be validated as safe, but when you're using the techniques of the technology of genetic engineering and gene edited in the open environment, which is now possible as technology is advancing, you're talking about the exposure of natural systems to the technology that cannot be managed, and we must not allow that. But unfortunately, again, that's where the industry is wanting to head. So we're talking about new kinds of, essentially, chemical sprays, but they're not just going to be chemical, they're going to be biological, and they're going to have gene editing technology within them. So going back to your question, this is a battle for the heart of New Zealand and our environment, but also the right to choose and also our economic well-being. And I don't believe that even the most fervent advocate for genetic engineering really wants to throw away the other side of things. They may do. I mean, to some extent, it's a threat to them. It's a competitor. Organic, sustainable, non-GMO agriculture is a competitor to the biotechnology industry wanting to replace those products. It's also a threat to our overseas food-producing competitors who don't want us to have a point of difference. If you can buy the same old level of contaminated GM crop from New Zealand as you can get it from America, go forth. If you have to have a premium for products from New Zealand, because there should be no such thing as a commodity from New Zealand, because it is clean and green and sustainable and ethical and safe and traceable, and the integrity of our food system is the best in the world, there won't be commodities. But globally, that's a disadvantage for our competitors. And therefore, there's a lot of interest in New Zealand falling, of New Zealand failing to maintain its non-GMO point of difference in the market, to make it all disappear, to allow consumers to have no choice. So going back to your point, right to all MPs, this is much bigger than any one political party. That said, the parties in power who've got the power to ride this through Parliament, New Zealand First, and absolute respect to Winston Peters for at least standing up and saying they will not support this bill without these safeguards. I guess the message to Winston Peters and the other MPs within New Zealand First is, hey guys, these safeguards are not there. Whatever they think, oh, well, okay, we're going to fix up this safeguard. We said we wouldn't support this bill unless there's safeguards, and we managed to get this safeguard in there. Not good enough. So I would encourage people to continue to support New Zealand First to actually stop this bill, or to radically transform it by the reintroduction of the precautionary principle, by the reintroduction of an ethics council, by the reintroduction of GE-free zones being allowed to be instigated by local councils, by the preservation of our non-GMO export advantage, by imposing liability on these companies pushing GE to say if something goes wrong and you contaminate or you cause harm, you're civilly liable for this, not just, oh, well, it's a bit of a problem, sorry guys, the public pays, which is the case today. It's called socialised risk. There is no strict liability on these companies, and no mandatory uses that tie the hands of the regulator to have to do something when it's against the national interest. Now, remind the New Zealand First MPs the name of their party. Remind National that their party refers to this nation, and this nation has an asset as a non-GMO exporter and as a respected producer of world-class, clean, safe, natural food. Do not throw that away, as you seem to be wanting to do. To the Greens, I'd say stand up for your roots, your values. You've got to defend nature. You've got to defend sustainable, organic and non-GMO production, and those alternatives that use mixed forage, that use regenerative agriculture that works with the grain of nature, not try to put a product in and ride over it. And I'd go to your supermarkets. I'd ask supermarkets and leading brands, are you, and it's not today. I mean, you could do this today, but do it next week and the next week. Because I'm really sad to say this, but if this bill proceeds as it, even if it is fixed up, if this continuation of non-labelling and non-traceability of these new gene-edited products goes ahead, then you need to go to your supermarket every week. You need to ask, is that cabbage GMO, gene-edited or not? Now, I believe that the supermarkets will come to the party. They know that they rely on their customers. And if they don't, if they join an industry hijack of the customer's right to choose, then we know that there's a darker force indeed in our supermarkets than we would want there to be, because it's all about consumer choice. That's why we've got a marketing advantage overseas, because the consumers overseas are making that choice. That's why Fonterra and Lewis Road Creamery use the non-GMO logo on their bottles in America, because people want that. So at the end of the day, that has to be protected. At the end of the day, that has to be protected. It's not being protected. It's not being defended. Supermarkets are part of that story. Obviously, MPs today are part of that story. But in the future, the consumer needs to go to trusted brands. So Zespri are part of that story. Fonterra are part of the story. We need to maintain scrutiny and awareness that unless we can trust these companies, they will do the wrong thing. So we need to make sure that they understand that consumer trust, both globally for brand New Zealand, but at a shop when I'm buying a Woolworths product, or my celery or my cabbage, I want to know that it's not GMO, that it's not gene edited. If it is, you need to reveal it voluntarily. So it's a multifaceted defence for the public against kind of industry on basic values like the right to choose.
All right, I'll probably wrap it up there, John. But thank you. I just want to say thank you for all of your hard work over the years and speaking up for all of us as well, because it's a big fight we're in. So thank you.